had pushed itself over the city like a heavy blanket, but the light from the burned warehouse still glowed in the dark, red and orange under a hanging cloud of smoke. The air raid sirens had stopped a few minutes earlier, leaving only the crackle of wet wood and the distant shout of wardens. Firefighters stood in a half circle around the front of the building, spraying water at the last hot spots, their boots deep in puddles that steamed when cold air hit them. The warehouse had once held sacks of flour, crates of canned food, and bundles of blankets meant for winter. Now its roof was gone on one side, and the upper windows were black and broken, like eyes that had seen too much. Civilians who had taken shelter nearby were already moving away. Some held hands, some clutched small bags. Most did not look back. They knew that after a raid came a second set of rules: curfew, street checks, and the need to get indoors before the next whistle. On the far side of the building, where the main fire was already under control, a woman sat on a low stack of half-charred boards. Her coat smelled of smoke, and her hair was dusted with ash that made the strands look gray in the warehouse light. She had gone down at some point during the raid, knocked off her feet by the sudden pressure of the blast and the rush of people running. Now she sat very still, her breathing too fast, her eyes fixed on the wet ground in front of her. The heat from the burned wall no longer reached her. Only the cold night did. Around her, the ground was messy with broken glass, splintered wood, and twisted metal bands that used to hold crates together. A bucket lay on its side near her feet, water slowly draining into cracks between the stones. A warden in a helmet passed by, waving a small torch as he checked the back of the warehouse for hidden fires. For a moment, his light passed across the woman's face, but he did not stop. He only called out, "Back area clear," and went on to the next corner. To him, she looked like one more person waiting for someone else. In wartime, it was easy to believe someone belonged to a group you could not see. A line of civilians streamed along the nearby street, guided by another warden's whistle toward a school basement that had been marked as a temporary shelter. Their footsteps made a steady scraping sound on the broken stone. A mother carried a sleeping child. An older man leaned on a stick and tried to keep up. A cart piled with blankets rolled past, pulled by two young boys whose faces were tight with effort. None of them came close to the burned side of the warehouse. They stayed where the wardens pointed, because people who followed directions had a better chance of being inside when the curfew bell rang. The woman on the boards tried once to stand. Her legs shook as if they did not belong to her. She managed to get halfway up, then sat down again, pressing her hands against her knees. The sharp smell of smoke made her eyes water. Somewhere behind her, part of the warehouse roof gave a low groan and sent a few more pieces of plaster sliding to the ground. She flinched at the sound, then sat still again. She had lost her sense of direction. Before the raid, she had been walking along the river road with a small parcel of bread and dried beans. When the sirens started, she had followed others into a loading bay near the warehouse. Then the world had become noise, light, and dust. Now the parcel was gone, and the river might as well have been on another continent. A fireman shouted to shut the main hydrant. The hoses went still. The biggest flames were gone now, leaving only small, angry spots that hissed when water touched them. A warden's truck moved off toward another block, its engine low and rough, carrying the last team that could guide civilians before curfew. The square around the warehouse began to empty. The light from the burned buildings seemed to grow weaker as more lamps were shut off to save power. The woman pulled her coat closer, but the smoke smell remained. She was not bleeding. She was not calling out. She was not on anyone's list. She was simply there, beside a burned warehouse in a war where being simply there could be the most dangerous place to stand. As the warehouse glow died down, the rhythm of the street changed from emergency to movement. Wardens pointed civilians toward shelter, firemen coiled hoses, and the last carts rattled across the stones. But the woman on the boards did not move with them. And that was when the city's second kind of pressure arrived. The pressure of being out of place after an air raid. A man, carrying a box of blankets, stopped a few meters away and asked a nearby warden which cellar was open. The warden pointed toward the school, adding that the church basement was filling too fast. The man nodded and hurried off, blankets bouncing inside the box. Then he turned briefly, looked at the woman, frowned as if she were blocking the flow of the street, and said to no one in particular, "People shouldn't sit there." He did not say why. In wartime, reasons were often skipped to save time. Two women carrying pots wrapped in towels passed next. One whispered that the warehouse should never have stored food, because food was a target. The other whispered back that the wardens had said the fire was contained, but she did not sound convinced. Their eyes flicked toward the woman beside the wall, and one of them made a small clicking sound with her tongue. The sound meant move. But she did not speak the word. The woman tried to stand again. This time she got all the way up, but her legs buckled, and she caught herself against the warm stones of the warehouse wall. The cold night hit her back and neck, and the smell of wet ash lingered on her coat. A wagon, loaded with buckets, rattled past, pulled by a fire brigade helper who shouted that the street needed to be cleared before the next inspection. When he saw her, he slowed just enough to say, "Don't stay here, miss," but he did not offer direction and did not wait for an answer. He turned the wagon and disappeared around the corner. After the raid, the city had a system for the people who moved. It had no system for the people who froze. A few meters away, a group of civilians formed a loose line, hoping to be counted for the school basement. A clerk from the district office stood beside them with a small lamp, marking how many had entered the cellar so far. The clerk lifted the lamp once to look at the woman near the wall, but he did not call her. The lamp turned back toward the line, because lines had priority, and stray individuals did not. A young woman with a scarf pressed against her mouth passed by, pulling her younger brother by the hand. She stopped briefly and asked if the woman by the wall had somewhere to go. The woman tried to answer, but coughed instead, smoke catching at the back of her throat. The younger boy tugged at his sister's arm, whispering that the siren could sound again and they would be caught outside. The sister hesitated, then gave the woman a final look, a look that meant she wished she had time, and then hurried off toward the sewer entrance where a warden directed children below. One by one, the minutes that civilians used for decisions began to run out. The wardens blew short whistles, doors closed, cellars filled. The clerk counted the last two people in his line, shut the ledger, and dimmed his lamp. The woman put a hand out to steady herself, then took one step toward the street, but her path was blocked by a civilian pushing a trolley of pots and blankets. "Not this way," he said sharply, as if she were making trouble. He pointed with his chin toward another street, then hurried off. That street was dark and unfamiliar. The warehouse wall behind her was warm but dangerous. The street ahead was cold but closing. The city did not shove her. It eroded her options until she did not have one. And in wartime, that counted as the same thing. In a city after a raid, silence was rare, and rumors moved faster than fire trucks. As the last shelter doors closed, a group of civilians who had lingered near the warehouse began to talk in half-whispers that were not really whispers at all. Someone asked why the woman was still outside. Someone else answered that she had been standing near the warehouse when the flames were high, and that no ordinary person would stay that close unless she was waiting for something. Another voice added that signalers often stayed near high points so aircraft could spot fires from above. None of them had ever seen a signaler, and none of them knew what a signaler actually did. But wartime fear did not require accuracy. It only required imagination. The woman did not defend herself. She kept coughing into her sleeve as the smoke pulled at her lungs. A teenager carrying 2 buckets told his mother that the wardens had warned people not to stand near suspicious areas. His mother looked at the woman and nodded in agreement, even though no warden had said any such thing. The boy then added, "Maybe she was marking the warehouse before the planes came." That statement traveled across the small group like it was news rather than invention. A man wearing a soot-covered scarf raised his eyebrows and said, "Well, she didn't run when we all did." That was true, but only because she had fallen when the blast pushed air down the alley. Truth in wartime often sounded incriminating if you said it with the wrong tone. Soon, the labeling began. "She's one of them," a woman whispered, though she never said who them was. Labels did not need full sentences. They only needed direction. The woman tried to take another step toward the street with the cellar entrances, but the man with the soot scarf held up his hand and said, "Best not go there. They're checking people." He said it like a warning, but his eyes said something closer to, "You don't belong there." A younger boy repeated the word traitor under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. His father shushed him, but the word had already escaped, and now hung in the cold air between the woman and the shelter street. It was a small word, but it carried weight. In wartime cities, accusation was faster than evidence, and easier than curiosity. A warden doing one last sweep of the warehouse perimeter shouted for civilians to clear the block. He did not point directly at the woman, but nearby civilians did. "Her first," someone called, and the warden glanced toward her with impatience. He did not ask why she was there, and he did not guide her. He simply motioned for her to move, and then continued with his sweep. She moved in the direction he pointed, but it led away from the shelters and toward the burned delivery yard, where smoke still drifted between half-broken pallets. The ground there was uneven, and her shoes slipped on wet ash as she tried to keep balance. She pressed her coat sleeve over her mouth to stop the coughing, but it did little. A few civilians who were still in the square watched her from a distance. They did not shout anymore. They only stared. Staring was the city's way of telling her she had been moved into the category of other. She tried to speak to a woman carrying 2 bowls wrapped in cloth. "Where can I go?" she asked in a thin voice. The woman did not slow down. She only said, "Not here," and kept walking. Her answer was not cruel. It was efficient. Efficiency became a kind of cruelty under curfew. When the woman reached the edge of the delivery yard, a new sound joined the quiet. Engines, low and steady, rolling down the street with a different rhythm than the fire brigades. The civilians looked up, and someone said, "Americans," with a mixture of relief and confusion. Medical trucks painted, with red crosses turned the corner and came to a slow stop near the burned warehouse. A few wardens jogged toward them, pointing at 2 injured men who had been found earlier. The civilians who had accused the woman shifted their attention toward the medics. They stepped away from her without thought. Rumor had served its purpose. It had pushed her out. The American medical trucks parked with a soft hiss of brakes, and 2 medics stepped down to help the injured that the wardens were guiding toward the tailgate. One carried a canvas bag of bandages and small bottles. The other unfolded a stretcher and set it near the curb so the wounded man could be lifted without bending his leg. They worked quickly, asking short questions in simple English, pointing, nodding, and adjusting coats over cold shoulders. The civilians near the warehouse finally relaxed enough to move closer. The arrival of medical units often pulled attention away from fear and toward procedure. The woman in the burned coat tried to get closer to the street as well, mostly because the delivery yard behind her was still smoky and uneven. But her legs did not obey smoothly. She slipped once on wet ash and caught herself on a stack of burned timber. One of the American medics glanced over, expecting to see another broken crate or a stray fireman. Instead, he saw a civilian woman alone with her hand pressed against the blackened wood, coughing hard enough that her shoulders shook. He watched for a few seconds longer, and what he saw made him pause. She was not moving like someone avoiding questions or waiting for someone. She was moving like someone whose lungs were tight and whose balance was thinning fast. He said something to the medic beside him, and the other man looked too. "Smoke?" he asked quietly, pointing. The first medic nodded. They knew the signs, they had seen them after warehouse burns in other cities. Smoke did not always kill quickly. It weakened, confused, and delayed. When spotter planes circled back to check results after a raid, people who could not move fast enough became easy targets for falling debris or stray shelling. He looked around for a civilian escort or family for the woman, but no one stood near her. The group that had whispered earlier had already turned toward the shelter street and pretended not to notice her. The medic lifted his hand halfway and called in a clear voice. "Ma'am," but she did not react. He called again, louder. "Ma'am, you need to get off the open ground." This time, she heard him but only managed one step before coughing again, bending forward slightly, as if the air had become too heavy to carry. The medic handed his stretcher to the other man, jogged across the wet stones, and stopped just beside her. He did not grab her or question her. He simply said, "You have to move," in a steady voice, gesturing toward the lower part of the warehouse wall. She looked up at him with eyes that were tired and unfocused, the kind of eyes that came from too much smoke and too little air. A warden blew a sharp whistle from the other side of the square and shouted an order the medic did not understand. Another warden waved his arms and pointed to the sky, and a few civilians began to hurry toward doorways. The medic glanced up and saw the faint silhouette of a small aircraft circling in the night, too small for bombs, but large enough to check targets. The medic made a fast decision. He took hold of the woman's coat sleeve, not tightly, not possessively, and pulled her behind a section of collapsed wall, where the smoke was thicker, but the sky was hidden. The move was not graceful, but it was controlled. He crouched beside her, keeping his voice level. "Stay here, don't stand," he said, and she nodded weakly. From the shelter street, one of the earlier civilians saw them and whispered to another, "She really was signaling." The other civilian watched and then shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "He wouldn't have helped her if she was." For the first time that night, someone questioned the rumor instead of repeating it. The medic wiped a line of soot from the woman's cheek with the back of his glove and scanned her breathing. She was no spy, no traitor, no signaler. She was just a civilian caught outside after a raid with no shelter, no escort, and no one who wanted to claim her. And in this war, that was enough danger for anyone. Once the medic had the woman behind the collapsed wall, the noise of the square changed again. A warden shouted for everyone to get low. The fire brigade ducked near their hoses, and the last remaining civilians flattened themselves against whatever stone they could find. The medic pressed his back against the broken bricks and kept one arm lightly out in front of the woman, not touching her, just making sure she did not try to stand while her head was still spinning. Above them, the small aircraft circled once more. It was not dropping bombs. It was watching the fire, checking for movement, and marking coordinates for artillery that might follow. The medic knew enough to recognize the pattern. He had seen these scenes in other cities, Paris, Antwerp, and once in a small Belgian port where an entire street had been cleared too late. His job was not to fight, predict, or strategize. His job was to pull people into corners and keep them alive until the next truck arrived or the next siren ended. The woman leaned forward and coughed again, her hand pressed flat against the bricks to steady herself. The medic reached into his satchel, pulled out a small water canteen, and held it near her mouth. She hesitated, not because she feared him, but because she was trying to remember how to drink without choking. He guided her hand to the canteen and said, "Small sips," in simple English. She obeyed. The water eased some of the ash from her throat, and her breathing slowed, though it remained shallow. When the aircraft finally pulled away toward another district, the wardens relaxed their shoulders and signaled that civilians could move again. But the square was no longer crowded. Most of the people had already reached doorways or basements with locks and lists. The medic stood up, offering his arm again, not for romance, not for control, but for balance. "Come on," he said, pointing toward the street with the medical trucks. She pushed herself upright with a small grunt, leaning on the wall for a moment before walking. Her steps were uneven, but she moved. Halfway across the courtyard, a new problem appeared. A second whistle, sharper and lower, cut through the night air. This was not the aircraft alert. This was the curfew whistle. The medic turned his head and swore softly under his breath. He knew what the whistle meant. Shelter doors closing, wardens locking gates, and MPs beginning street checks. The woman blinked, confused by the sudden rush around them. A warden pointed toward the shelter street and shouted, "Make space for the escort." The medic did not waste time explaining. He put his hand on the woman's coat sleeve again and guided her toward the medical trucks. One of the other medics raised an eyebrow. "Smoke?" he asked. The first medic nodded. "And no shelter." That was all the explanation needed. In wartime, the phrase "no shelter" carried more urgency than a broken bone. The second medic lowered the back flap of the truck and cleared a space near the water tins. "Get her in," he said. The wardens near the corner shouted again for civilians to move. The woman hesitated, unsure if she was allowed to climb into a vehicle meant for wounded. The first medic pointed at the metal step and said, "Inside, now." She obeyed. The truck's interior smelled of iodine, blankets, and cigarette smoke. A few crates were strapped to the walls, and a lantern swung from an overhead hook with each small movement of the chassis. The medic climbed in after her, handed her a blanket, and banged on the panel to signal the driver. The driver did not need instructions. He had already seen the curfew situation forming. The truck lurched forward, turning down a narrower road where wardens held lanterns and waved civilians toward authorized cellars. The raid was over, the rumors were over. The fire was dying. But this new phase, curfew, was just beginning. And curfew was its own kind of battlefield for civilians who had nowhere to go. The medical truck rolled down the narrow street with its lantern swinging overhead, and the wheels splashed through shallow puddles where hose water had mixed with ash. The woman sat on a crate near the wall, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, coughing into the cloth as the smoke continued to irritate her lungs. The medic squatted beside her to keep her from sliding off the crate when the truck jerked over broken stones. "Breathe slow," he said, demonstrating with his own hand. Down, then out. She tried to follow the motion, and after a few attempts the coughing eased enough for her to keep her head lifted. Outside the back flap, the city moved in different rhythms. Wardens calling instructions, civilians running the last meters toward shelter doors, and MPs positioning themselves near major intersections to catch people who had no papers, no billets, and no escort. For those without any attachments, the night could end in questioning or detention, and detention meant cold benches, not blankets. The woman pulled the blanket tighter. The medic knocked on the wall of the truck twice, and the driver shouted back, "Garage!" The woman looked up, confused by the word. The medic pointed ahead. "First aid post," he explained in simple English. "You'll be checked." She nodded, even though she did not fully understand. The truck made a final turn and slowed as it entered a tram garage whose doors had been thrown open to make space for stretchers and supply tables. A Red Cross flag hung from a beam, and wardens directed people inside with gestures rather than words. The smell of hot water and antiseptic mixed with smoke and wet wool. Inside, a line of cots had been set against one wall. Civilians who had taken light injuries were being examined by medics, using small metal torches to check eyes and breathing. A woman in a white apron ladled hot water into enamel cups and handed them out to keep throats from closing. The medic guided the woman from the truck to a wooden chair near the water table. "Sit," he said. She sat. He lifted her chin slightly to look at her eyes, then asked, "Smoke? Warehouse?" She nodded. He made a single mark on his clipboard and waved another medic over to bring water. The woman sipped slowly, still coughing between swallows. Her coat steamed slightly from the sudden warmth. A warden approached the medic and asked if she was registered. The medic shook his head and replied, "Civilian without shelter. Taking her through." The warden nodded and did not ask further questions. Medical escort outranked suspicion. After a few minutes, the medic asked if she could stand. She managed to rise and follow him deeper into the garage, past the supply tables and the stacks of folded blankets. He showed her a small bulletin board where wardens had written the night's shelter status in large numbers. School cellar, full, church cellar, full, district basement, full, depot annex. 3 spots, tram tunnel, limited space. The medic tapped the bottom row, tram tunnel. "We'll take you there," he said. The tram tunnel was not a luxury shelter. It had benches, blankets, and coal stoves, but no beds. Civilians slept sitting up, wrapped in wool, listening to the water drip from the ceiling. But it was safer than the street, and warmer than the courthouse steps. The woman nodded, partly because she agreed, and partly because there was nothing else to do. The medic returned to the truck and spoke with the driver. The driver nodded and wiped his face with a blackened rag. 2 wardens opened the garage doors wider to let the truck leave again. The medic gestured for the woman to climb back aboard. She moved more steadily now, coughing less, holding the blanket tightly with both hands. The truck rumbled back into the street. The raid had ended hours ago, but the night was still dividing the city into 2 groups, those behind locked doors and those who had to be escorted to find them. The drive to the tram tunnel shelter did not take long, but it crossed enough intersections for the woman to understand the importance of the medic's presence. At the first checkpoint, 2 MPs waved lanterns and stopped the truck, asking for curfew status. The medic leaned out of the canvas flap and replied simply, "Medical escort, smoke inhalation civilian." That short phrase changed everything. Instead of suspicion, the MPS stepped aside and lifted the barricade, allowing the truck to pass without further questions. At the next intersection, a warden tried to signal that the tunnel might already be full, but when he saw the medic's Red Cross brassard, he redirected them through a side street used for stretcher cases. The woman watched this quietly. She understood now that she was not moving because of charity or personal favor, but because the medic's role created a path that would not have existed for her alone. Without him, she would have remained beside the warehouse, one more civilian left behind until morning. The truck finally stopped beside a tunnel entrance near the tram depot. 2 wardens stood at the door with clipboards and lanterns, checking people one by one before allowing them to pass. The medic jumped down first, then offered his arm for balance as the woman climbed out. He did not hurry her. He let her straighten her blanket and breathe. When they reached the tunnel door, a warden raised his clipboard. "Name?" he asked. The woman opened her mouth, but only a weak sound came out. The medic stepped forward and said, "Under medical escort, smoke exposure," while handing over his clipboard form. The warden read the top line, saw the Red Cross stamp, and nodded. "Authorized," he said, marking a space on his sheet. He did not ask for district papers, work permits, or ration slips. He did not ask why she had been alone outside the warehouse, or whether someone else should have been with her. The escort had answered those questions already. Inside the tunnel, a shelter volunteer walked up with a stack of blankets. She placed one over the woman's shoulders and guided her toward a bench near a coal stove. A small queue of civilians sat nearby, most wrapped in wool, heads bowed, waiting for the night to pass. The woman took a seat and set her hands inside the blanket to warm them. The volunteer asked softly, "Smoke?" The woman nodded once. The volunteer pointed toward the stove and said, "Stay near heat. Water is coming." Then she wrote a brief note on a card and placed it at the woman's feet, so that any passing warden or medic would know her condition without requiring her to speak. It was a small card, brown and creased, but it served as recognition, something to say she belonged in the space rather than being tolerated in it. The medic checked once more to ensure she was stable. She looked up at him, unsure what to say. He pointed to the card and then to the blankets. "You're in," he said. It was a phrase a civilian could understand. She nodded. There were no speeches, no applause, no dramatic heroics. Just a seat, a blanket, permission to stay, and a night without being questioned or pushed aside. For someone who had been left beside a burning warehouse hours earlier, it was dignity restored in the simplest form, available during war. Acknowledgement, shelter, and official acceptance into the protected part of the night. The tunnel shelter settled into its usual nighttime rhythm once the last civilians entered. Earthen walls swallowed most of the street noise, and only the occasional muffled siren or distant clatter hinted at what continued above ground. Coal stoves gave off steady heat, and blankets rustled as people shifted on the wooden benches. The woman sat close to the stove, breathing more evenly now, though every few minutes she coughed softly into her blanket to clear what little smoke still lingered in her throat. A volunteer walked past and handed her an enamel cup filled with warm water. She held it between both hands until the heat soaked through her fingers, then drank slowly. There were no questions, no interrogation, no judgment. The small card at her feet did the talking. It told anyone who passed that she had been found, escorted, and treated. Across the tunnel, the medic spoke with a warden about where the next shelter rotation would occur in the morning. The warden pointed toward a street on a hand-drawn map pinned to the tunnel wall, explaining that the depot would reopen after dawn and that district lists would be updated if trucks arrived. They did not discuss victory, tactics, or vengeance. They talked about blankets, space, and heat, things that determined survival for civilians who no longer had homes with roofs or windows. After a few minutes, the medic walked back to the woman and checked her breathing again. She met his eyes briefly and nodded to show that she was stable. He tapped the card on the ground once, as if confirming its authority, then pulled a folded blanket from a nearby stack and placed it beside her. "For later," he said. She understood. He was preparing to leave, not because he was abandoning her, but because medics never stayed in one place long during wartime. There were always other streets, other shelters, other fires that would produce other civilians with smoke in their lungs. Before he stepped away, he pointed one more time toward the volunteers and the wardens. It was a silent message. "They know. You're safe here." She nodded again. He walked toward the exit tunnel where a few other medics were gathering, their bags slung over their shoulders. They exchanged quiet words with the wardens and then disappeared into the night to check another district. Inside the tunnel, people shifted further under their blankets. One elderly woman whispered a prayer. A young boy slept sitting up with his head on his mother's arm. An old man stared at the stove, thinking of something he would never speak aloud. No one looked at the woman with suspicion or disdain. No one accused her of standing in the wrong place or being from the wrong district. She was simply another civilian waiting for morning inside a protected space. Hours later, the whistling steam of a tram from a nearby yard signaled that dawn was approaching. The war had not ended in the night. It had simply paused long enough for shelters to do their quiet work. Volunteers moved through the tunnel, waking people with gentle taps and handing out cups of warm water. The woman stood slowly, blanket still around her shoulders, coughing once before breathing in the cooler morning air. A warden pointed her toward the exit ramp. "Depot opens after sunrise. he said. She nodded and walked toward the door. When she reached the surface, smoke still hung low over the street, and the burned warehouse remained in ruins. But she was not sitting beside it anymore. She stepped forward, wrapped in blankets, with a card that told her she belonged somewhere, at least for now. The war continued elsewhere, but she no longer faced it from the edge of a fire with no one to speak for her.